And we are live. Good morning, everybody. I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute for the Humanities, an alternative college and high school here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. Today is, believe it or not, day 277 of the project. And we're getting through the life of Napoleon Bonaparte this week, looking today at his invasion of Russia and his first abdication, certainly enough to fill out a class or 10 on that point. So let's get some nice background music, and then we'll get into our notice concerning the Institute here in Connecticut, and as well, our little poem for the day, a little song appropriate to Napoleon. What shall we do for our music? Sunny Morning. This is the piano piece that we have, and we'll just adjust it up slightly, and we'll be right as rain. Okay, so here we are, and let's take a look at our screen share for what we have at the Institute. Now, the project that we're enjoying here, at least part of it on our daily broadcasts, is really the core of our studies at the Institute. So our top shelf product, if you forgive the language, is a 3-year study of human history integrated between history, literature, philosophy, and some auxiliary sciences. And you will leave us with the equivalent knowledge of an undergraduate degree in history and literature. So the project and the 3-year commitment for our enrolled students is the trophy, the gold academic trophy here. But we do have dozens of individual courses and studies and tutorials taught by myself and the capable staff of the Institute. And one of our recent collaborations is with Angela Malik, and that concerns music. Angela is a virtuoso in more ways than one, and that certainly includes her wide knowledge of music theory as well as practical points. And so you can check out our poster here with Angela, and very soon we're going to have our little interview that we lately recorded that will also be published here. And on the poster, you can also see at the bottom ways to contact Angela, and she's more than happy to sit down with you and kind of get a bead on where you or your children might need a special direction when it comes to music knowledge. You might be having a practical thing on the horizon, like a audition coming up, maybe for a play, or just a more general interest in chant, perhaps, or classical music or whatever. Angela really is top in her field in this regard. So please do check this out and consider availing yourself of this latest collaboration. This via our Restauratio Center, the Apocatastasis, and then we have a more general, more anodyne Restauratio Center. And so you can see the color schema is slightly different. I should talk on the Restauratio Center sometime in the future. All right. So we're going to move now into our art piece for the day. And that is the Bonnie Bunch of Roses. Now, you heard me say last week, as well as yesterday, the Bonnie Bunch of Roses refers to England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. And ultimately, the British Foreign Office, we could call it by this point, that was responsible for time and again cobbling together these coalitions of continental powers to fight Napoleon. There were several coalitions, 8 altogether, I believe. I can double check that. And they kept getting defeated by Les Petits Caporales. Napoleon bested them time and again. And part of that had to do with the revolution, quite literally, the revolutionary French army, revolutionary in more ways than one, using conscription and also the meritocracy that's that's predicate in liberalism. And again, England would come up with these. Very similar, I would actually say, to how NATO is behaving in Ukraine. And of course, I don't think it's a secret to point out that it's the British who are behind the adventure and the provocation of Russia in Ukraine. And so, if you want a parallel, that's not at all inappropriate to see. Um, one power that just keeps losing, but just keeps cobbling together more armies and more weapons and more aid packages and all of this. It was the same stuff in Napoleon's time. And to an extent, we remember the old military statement, I believe from Stalin, or Zhukov or one of his generals, that quantity has a quality of its own. Quantity has a quality all of its own. We say quantity doesn't equal quality, and so it does not. But one of the strategies you have, potentially, particularly if you have a lot of resources, is just to slowly grind down your opponent, break him down in attrition. We call this sort of a war, this long game, waiting your opponent out, slowly grinding them down. This is a war of attrition. And very often, what you see with wars of attrition, and I think that's fair to say, that's the strategy of the coalitions on the part of the British. Oh, I mean, it is an attritional approach, even though you have some very hot battles individually, many hot battles. The overall strategy of the British, knowing that their coalitions are probably going to be knocked down and defeated, and they'll just have to start again, is to wear down Napoleon. That's a war of attrition. And one of the things you'll notice all very, very consistently with wars of attrition is that they drag on and on and on and on. And then they snap very quickly. They snap like a rubber band. Think indeed of General Washington's strategy with Cornwallis in the American Revolution. Think about the conclusion of the American Civil War 80 years later and how quickly the Confederate government folded once the Army of Northern Virginia finally snapped. You can think about the Germans in 1918. And then, of course, the Americans, as well as the French before them, in Vietnam, the Americans in Afghanistan. Guaranteed, when Ukraine falls, it will be the same reality. And people will be saying, wow, I never saw that coming. I never saw how the Ukrainian army would collapse so quickly, right? But until then, it seems to drag on forever. The Taliban war went on for 20 years. And people from all over the world would come to Afghanistan and ask the toothless Taliban with sandals and rusty weapons, how on earth are you going to defeat the United States corporation? And without a tooth in their head, the Taliban would smile and just tap their wrists. And that's the nature of attritional warfare. It grinds on and on and on, and then it snaps quickly. And that's what we see with Napoleon and his first abdication following the conquest of, the attempted conquest of Russia, failure there, and then the absolute and actual conquest on the part of the Bonnie Bunch of Roses of Paris. So let's hop along, Cassidy. And this piece, again, is entitled The Bonnie Bunch of Roses. The scene, as we'll probably lay out here, the scene is actually after Napoleon's death, and his son is dreaming of doing great things like his father. The only problem is his son is on his deathbed as well. So here's this summary. There was a time when England, Ireland, and Scotland was more or less one. During Napoleon's period, now, time, the name given to England, Ireland, and Scotland was the Bonnie Bunch of Roses. I must say that sentence again. That's interesting punctuation. During Napoleon's period now, time, okay, that's just a typo. Okay, that needs to be edited. And this is the story of Napoleon's son and the conversation with his mother. And he said he was going to emulate his father and take an army and conquer Moscow, and then return and get a body bunch of roses. And get the body bunch of roses. Conquer version. But his mother told him, "Your father tried the same thing. Now he's dead in St. Helena. Anyway, you're on your deathbed," she said, "so stay here. Here's what happened." I suspect this is a literal transcription of somebody speaking before singing the song, hence the very strange second sentence punctuation. Anyway, here we go. It's a great little piece. By the margin of the ocean, one pleasant evening in the month of June, when all the feathered songsters their liquid notes they sweetly tune. It's there I met a female, and her features were signs of woe, conversing with young Bonaparte concerning the body bunch of roses. Oh, outspakes the young Napoleon, he takes his mother by the hand, saying, "Mother dear, be patient until I'm able to take command. Then I'll raise a mighty army and through tremendous dangers go, and ne'er will I return again till I conquer the bonny bunch of roses. Oh, when you first met great Bonaparte, you fell upon your bended knees. You asked your father's life of him, he granted it right manfully. 'Twas then he took an army and o'er the frozen Alps did go. He said, I'll conquer Moscow and return for the bonny bunch of roses. Oh, he took 600,000 men and kings likewise to bear his train. He was so well prepared for that he could sweep the world again. But when he come to Moscow, he was overpowered by sleet and snow, and with Moscow all a-blazing, he lost the bonny bunch of roses. Oh, now son, be not too venturesome, for England is the heart of oak, and England, Ireland, Scotland, their unity shall ne'er be broke. Remember your brave father in St. Helena now he lie, and if you follow after, beware the bonny bunch of roses. Oh, now mother dear, I bid adieu. I now lie on my dying bed. If I'd lived, I'd be more clever, but now I droop my useful head. And when my bones lie mouldering and weeping willows o'er me grow, the name of young Napoleon will enshrine the bonny bunch of roses. Oh, Domine, miserere nobis, de gracias. Thus is the folk song, The Bonny Bunch of Roses. Oh, as I recommended the other day, Frank Hart has a recording of this. He did a whole CD on Napoleonic folk songs, I believe entitled I Am Napoleon Bonaparte. And this is one of the pieces, The Bonny Bunch of Roses. Oh, okay, so we're moving along now. We're going to change the camera and get into H.G. Wells and his outline of history. This is forming, especially for these daily broadcasts, real skeleton of the project. You can find out all about this and how you can join us, so depending on your state in life and your ability to commit to this work of mastering the Western humanities. You may do that by going to our project website down below in the description. And there's all sorts of ways, whether you're just an informal learner, but a learner no less, that you can join us. And also, indeed, most especially enroll in our work, in our course. And I'm going to just sight the camera here. Oh, you get dizzy. There we go. Okay. Anyway, let's get our boots on and conquer Moscow. That's what we're after, and that's where we're going. So we talked yesterday how Napoleon came to power at the end of the Directory with the coup with his brother Lucien, and not for the first time abandoning an army, this time in Egypt. But let's see how things develop from there. Just to wet our whistle, we begin. We will not detail the steps by which Napoleon became emperor. His coronation was the most extraordinary revival that is possible to imagine. Caesar was no longer the model Napoleon was now Charlemagne. He was crowned emperor, not indeed at Rome, but in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. Pope Pius VII, the most ill-abused man, most roughly treated by Napoleon, had been brought. He had been brought, passive participle. He had been brought from Rome to perform the ceremony. At the climax, Napoleon I seized the crown famously, waved the Pope aside, and crowned himself. All right, so notice a few things here. Napoleon is willing to play ball with the church, but it's going to be very clear who's who. So Napoleon will sign the Concordat with Pius VII, and the Catholic Church will be allowed back into France, and it will actually be the Catholic Church. There really was no Catholic Church between the Council of Trent and the French Revolution in France. It is not true to say France was the eldest daughter of the church, whoever coined that. France had, after the Reformation, basically an autonomous church. And then what happened, as I explained last week, is that this autonomous Gallican church, all of those sorts of people, clerics, jumped into the constitutional church. When the French Freemasons made the constitutional during church, where the clergy took an oath of allegiance to the Declaration of Rights of Man and the Citizen, all of the Gallican clergy, near enough, they joined the constitutional church. Cool Turtles kindly asked, "What is this?" Hi, Cool Turtles. Very cool name. And great French words here. What this is, briefly, is a daily working through of what we call at Apocatastasis the project. So that's looking at poetry and history in a synchronized way annually. This is the core curricula at the college, in addition to some other texts for our enrolled students. And that's what we're doing here. So we're making our way through all of human history. We're going to start again on the 31st of August. That's when we begin this book again and our poetry again. And I hope I answered that worthy query. So, getting on with things here. Thank you for that question. I always welcome these questions, of course. And you can find out more about what this is by going to the project link down below, Cool Turtles. And that's a very cool name indeed. Okay, so we see Napoleon at his coronation. Please keep the questions coming. I'm happy to entertain them. We see the coronation of Napoleon. He's willing to work with the Catholic Church, but he's going to make sure he's boss. And part of that is kidnapping Pius VII and doing this stunt in Notre Dame. Much like the Catholic Church will do after the Italian Risorgimento, where the Freemasons steal the Papal States, effectively. After the French Revolution, the Church was very pissy towards the revolutionary government, even during the time of the Directory, even during the early period of Napoleon's reign. And it does take some cajoling on the part of Napoleon, and some coming to sense on the part of Pius VII, to bury the hatchet, so to speak, and to play nice. And so, just a little bit of trivia: one of the stipulations that came up in the Concordat was that at the end of the office, at the end of the divine office, there had to be an injunction, just like there is for the dead. There had to be an injunction for not just the dead, but also for the French Republic. And that was actually a point of contention. In any case, the four daughter republics of France now were to become kingdoms. So he gets into the breakdown here. I leave it to you to read through this section. You can access this text freely on the project site. Let's get, however, into the Russian stuff in particular. And to do that, we're going to start here on this edition, page 746. We have a map here that's worth taking a look at. I also have other maps queued up. So basically he's always waiting. Napoleon is always waiting for Russia to come around. Even right now, if you follow politics, you know that there is a special relationship between France and Russia, and it goes back to before this time. In fact, you say, "What the hell are you talking about?" Emmanuel Macron tried to build a coalition just last month once the Americans pulled out of the Ukraine adventure. Yes, that is true. That superficially, for this moment, Russia and France are beefing along with NATO. But even if you follow the nonsense in the Ukrainian adventure, you know that France has a special line of access to Russia. And if you don't believe me, look at how Emmanuel Macron and Vladimir Putin were interacting in the weeks before Russia was provoked into invading Ukraine. There were many, many late night conferences, sometimes in person, between Macron and Putin. The reason is the connection of France politically and especially culturally, and Russia is a very deep one and goes back certainly to the 18th century, if not before. So, getting back to Napoleon, almost like Hitler would in the 20th century, Hitler always had the hope that Great Britain would come to its senses and join the new order of Europe. Likewise, in a sense, Napoleon was hoping that Russia would come to its senses, and maybe just a slight, invasion of 600,000 men would, bring them to their senses. Just like, to make the parallel, just like, maybe the Battle of Britain will sober up the English and that idiot Churchill to joining the right. Now, it didn't work in either case. Turns out if you invade your potential allies, or who you think are your allies or could be allies, turns out they don't appreciate that, and they don't join you. What a surprise. Okay, so let's take a look here at the build up to the Russian stuff. So in the next 2 years, his affairs crumbled apace. Napoleon, he was no longer. Remember what his mother said. What did Napoleon's mother say? He was sending his mother all of this money, and his mother said, I want to go casting about here. His mother said, "No, I'm keeping the money because when this is all over, you're going to need it. We're going to need this money. This is not going to last." You might not know it as you're stealing crowns out of the Pope's hands in the Notre Dame Cathedral and slinging your armies of hundreds of thousands of men around Europe. This is not going to last, Napoleon. The wheel of fortune will turn. I'm going to save that money for a rainy day. That's what his mother said. Anyway, he was no longer the leader and complement of the revolution, no longer the embodiment of a spirit of a world reborn. He was just a new and raw sort of autocrat. He had estranged all free-spirited men, and he had antagonized the church. Kings and Jacobins were at one when it come to the question of his overthrow. So notice this, it's not just the old altar and throne order, it's not just the plotting British, but also the radicals in France have just as much of an axe out for Napoleon by 1810, let's say. Britain was now his inveterate enemy. Spain was blazing with a spirit that a Corsican should have understood. It needed only a breach with Russia's Alexander I to set this empire of bluff and stage scenery towards its downfall. Now, I just want to go back to this just to be very clear what we're looking at. So we have, of course, France here. This is direct rule as it's laid out. And the vertical hatching, direct rule, a little bit darker. And then the cross hatching we see is subjected states. And so let's just rack things up here. So we have France and northern Italy and a bit of Dalmatia, where the doggies come from, and the Low Countries under direct rule, a bit of Germany. And then under subject states, we have Spain, as well as Germany, this Confederation of the Rhine. Of course, all these things have new revolutionary Latin names. And then the Duchy of Warsaw, what we may call maybe, you know, marking time. Oh, sorry, marking time. Poland. We talked about Poland and how Poland was dismembered about a generation before this map of 1810. The Duchy of Warsaw is a subject state. Notice again, just from our time here, right? So this is the Bonnie Bunch of Roses, includes all of Ireland at this point, Scotland, Wales, everyone forgets about, and England. This is the Bonnie Bunch of Roses. And remember, it is always the policy of England, whether it was Napoleon's time or before or after, even to this day, to maintain the balance of power. You can never understand how Britain operates on the continent except for the balance of power. Allow me to close the window. Of course, at 8 o'clock in the morning, our hillbilly neighbors would start cutting the grass. All right. Anyway. Moreover, there was a vague kind of sentimental greatness about Alexander. He was given mystical religiosity. He had the conception of a mission for Russia, which is very, very consistent if you know Russians and how Russians see their country. There's a very absolute strain there of Russia having this almost mystical aspect to it. And we see that here with Alexander. But bringing peace to Europe seemed to be quite compatible with the annexation of Finland, of most of Poland, and of the great portions of the Turkish Empire. Do not forget that the Ottomans are about. Particularly, he wanted to resume trading with Britain, against which Napoleon had set his face, right? This is the blockade. So while Britain is very happy to get continental Europeans dying for them in their endless coalitions that Napoleon destroys time and again, the British are putting skin in the game with their blockade all along the Bay of Biscay and the English Channel. That's where you do have the British ships patrolling. Much Napoleon's great headache later on. Skipping ahead here. It was in late October, too late altogether, before Napoleon decided. Actually, let me start up here. So this is the ingress. I'm going to show you a map of Poland soon, or rather of Napoleon's Russian expedition, including Poland, soon. But first, the explanation. Napoleon fought his way across Poland and Russia to Moscow before the winter. For the most part, the Russian armies declined battle. Retreat. And even before the winter closed in upon his position, and his position became manifestly dangerous. He took Moscow in October, expecting that this would oblige Alexander to make peace. Alexander would not make peace. Napoleon found himself in much the same position as Darius had been 2,300 years before. You know the Russians, what do they call the winter militarily? They call it General Winter, the greatest weapon that Russia has, General Winter. In South Russia. Okay. The Russians, still unconquered in a decisive battle, raided his communications, wasted his army, disease helping them. Even before Napoleon reached Moscow, he had lost 150,000 men, but he lacked the wisdom of Darius and would not retreat. You say, wow, that's unbelievable. Yeah, except that way more than that have died in Ukraine. Right now, I mean, it is a lot of men, but it's amazing how huge amounts of men can die and be a blip on the screen or a blip in the book. Wow, 150,000 men. You see, how could that be? And yet, stranger things have happened. The winter remained mild for an unusually long time. Napoleon could have escaped, but instead remained in Moscow, making impossible plans. He had been marvelously lucky in all his previous gambles with fate. He had escaped undeservedly from Egypt. He had been saved from destruction in Britain by the British naval victories, but now he was in the net again, for the last time. And this time he was not to escape. Perhaps he would have to winter in Moscow, but the Russians smoked him out. They set fire to and burnt most of the city famously. In late October it was, too late altogether, before Napoleon decided to return. He made an ineffectual attempt to break through a fresh line of retreat to the southwest, and then turned the faces of the survivors of his Grand Army towards the country that they had devastated in their advance. I'm going to show you very soon a schematic, and you'll see the huge amounts of men that were lost, especially on the retreat. They say that when an army, when an army retreats, they tend to lose a lot more than in the advance, which makes perfect sense, doesn't it? People are tuckered out, they're discouraged. Immense distances separated them from any friendly territory. General Winter was in no hurry. For a week, the Grand Army struggled through the mud. Then came sharp frost, and the first flakes of snow, then snow, and snow. A little bit of literary little flourish there on the part of H.G. Wells. But yes, I mean, this is General Winter, and one of the remarkable things for a man who is occasionally unbelievably incompetent for all of his skill and energy, Napoleon is able to garner unbelievable amounts of support from his army, even in defeat. You have these scenes of men that are, freezing in the snow, dying, cracked through the ice, falling into frozen lakes. The last words out of their mouth were "Long live the Emperor." Right? Napoleon was able to very much ingratiate himself rather, with his soldiers by walking often and not using the horse, by dressing commonly like the soldiers, by speaking to the soldiers. He had that touch. He had that charismatic touch, so much so that dying men would yell his name out as their final words. Slowly, discipline in Napoleon's army dissolved. The hungry army spread its mere bands of marauders. The peasants, if only in self-defense, rose against these marauders and waylaid them and murdered them. A cloud of light cavalry, Scythians still, that's an old ancient name for Russia, Scythia, hunted them down. The retreat is one of the great tragedies in history. At last, I want to just read these paragraphs and then we're going to take a look at a map here. At last, Napoleon and his staff and a handful of guards and attendants reappeared in Germany, bringing no army with them, but you left with hundreds of thousands of men. Where is your army? Following them were only straggling and demoralized bands. The Grand Army, retreating under Marat, reached Königsberg in a disciplined state, but only about 1,000 strong out of 600,000. Let that sink in. Napoleon went into Russia with 600,000 men, and only 1,000 escaped. Almost reminds you of Xenophon's retreat in Greek lore and Persian lore. From Königsberg, Marat fell back. The Prussian contingent had surrendered to the Russians. The Austrians had gone homeward to the south, everywhere scattered fugitives. Ragged and lean and frostbitten, spread news of the disaster. Napoleon's magic was nearly exhausted, but not as nearly as we might think. We'll find out tomorrow. He had fled post-haste to Paris. Now we're building up to the first abdication, so pay attention. This is right on the heels of the Russian disaster. He began to order new levies, gather fresh armies amidst the wreckage of his world empire. How do you think the parents of France like that? Another army, another grand army? Austria turned against him. All Europe was eager to rise against this defaulting trustee of freedom, this mere usurper. At this point, we want to meditate on the The fickle nature of power, the fickle nature. Napoleon was topped, everyone was his friend. Now he suffered defeat, and you see people like Austria and all sorts that were glomming on to Bonapartism, now they're flaking away. It's amazing how people change with the winds of politics. All Europe was eager to rise against this usurper. He had betrayed the new order of the French Revolution. The old order he had saved and revived now destroyed him. Prussia rose, and the German War of Liberation began. Sweden joined his enemies. Later, Holland revolted. All the allies are breaking away. Murat had rallied about 14,000 Frenchmen around his disciplined nucleus in Posen. And this force retreated through Germany, as a man might retreat who had ventured into a cage full of drugged lions and found the effects of the drug were evaporating. This is, again, H.G. Wells, the author. H.G. Wells, the prose author. Napoleon, with his fresh force, took up the chief command in the spring and won a great battle at Dresden. And then for a time, he seems to have gone to pieces intellectually and morally. He became insanely irritable with moods of inaction. He did little or nothing to follow up the Battle of Dresden. In September, the Battle of the Nations was fought around about Leipzig, after which the Saxons, who had hitherto followed his star, now they went over to the Allies. At the end of the year, the French were beaten back into France. 1814 was the closing campaign. France was invaded from the east and the south. Swedes, Germans, Austrians, Russians crossed the Rhine. British and Spanish come through the Pyrenees. Once more, Napoleon fought brilliantly, but now he fought ineffectually. The Eastern armies did not so much defeat him as pushed past him. And Paris capitulated in March. A little later at Fontainebleau, the emperor abdicated. This is Napoleon's first abdication, 1914. In Provence, on his way out of the country, his life was endangered by a royalist mob. It's not for nothing that H.G. Wells mentions this. How did Napoleon cut his teeth as a young artillerist? By shooting into a royalist mob, right? Let them get a whiff of grape shot, famously. That is how Napoleon made a name for himself. So now, his mother was right. Everything came full course. The wheel of fortune had changed. And now, once more, except this time in a much weaker position, Napoleon's life is endangered by a royalist mob. Now, tomorrow, we're going to look at the exile to Elba, 100 Days, Waterloo, and the final exile to St. Helena. The most cruel thing that the British did in all of Napoleon's life was to exile the French tornado to this rock where he would spend the rest of his life pacing in circles. Before we depart for the day, I did want to show a few things here. I'll turn on my camera. Okay. The first of which is the... Hey, there we go. Got the camera. Let's take a look at the schema of Napoleon's invasion into Russia. So this is basically, you can't really tell, I suppose, on the computer. It doesn't help that the map's in beige and everything else is in beige. But this is Napoleon's invasion of Russia, the route there, which is in gray, the bottom more or less. And then the retreat, which is in red. And what this is showing is visually, not just the route of the armies, but by the width of the line, you can also see the casualties Napoleon has taken. So if you look very much at the beginning of the campaign, the little gray line is just that. It's little. And then it gets fatter and fatter, and the numbers, of course, are casualties. And this is overlaid with the battles, such as Maubert and certain cities as well, Doeg, um, Yakima, and so forth, all the way to Moscow. There's your Moscow. And then the retreat, which is the same format with battles and casualties given in the red, the pink, and you can see the thickness of the line is what you want to keep an eye out for because that is visually showing the volume of casualties. And if you want to know where the 600,000 soldiers Napoleon began with ended up, well, you can take a look at the schematic here. They all died or were captured or went over and surrendered to the enemy. So, um, and you can see variations of this easily enough online. This is just the Russian campaign, 1912, or rather 1812 to 1813. They do have here, worth seeing, a pie chart, even more starkly, illustrating the unbelievable casualties of the French army. So, obviously, the pie represents Napoleon's army going into Russia, and the little sliver, about 2%, 2% are what survive the whole campaign. So, most stark, unbelievably stark attrition that Napoleon um, suffered, and therefore you can see why he was forced to abdicate once the Bonnie Bunch of Roses and the other coalition members did their final fight to the finish and pushed into France itself, captured Paris. Napoleon really had nothing else to do. He had no more army. He had no more way to control the coalition. He was prostrate, and so he had to accept um, the offer to become, without being funny, the Emperor of Elba. I suppose there was something of mockery in that, because Napoleon was allowed to keep his royal titles, interestingly enough. But he was basically the town mayor of Elba, a little island um, off of the French and Italian coast. By the way, in terms of Napoleonic culture, I always bring this up, and the students, that's I know why you're bringing that up, Mr. Colm. This is actually Napoleon's sister, and the reason I bring this up is uh, actually not really for if the marble is correct, rather pretty girl, but rather what impresses me about this is this cushion that she's sitting on. This is marble, but it looks like a cushion. It's a remarkable piece of sculpting. This is Venus Victrix, Venus the Conqueror, and this was um, indeed the modeling was Napoleon's sister, obviously representing the goddess of love and amour and so forth. And interestingly, holding an apple, holding a fruit there. Um, so cross mythologies, perhaps. But the pillows here are really are remarkable, and as is the bed too. And stuff like that. But anyway, a little bit of Napoleonic culture there, and Christmas. If you want to know what a Christmas present you can get me, Venus Victrix. All right, so that does it here. I know it's a huge thing to do to cover the invasion of Russia in just one single class. I think I had one more article up. Let's just see. This is a short one here, and then we'll bring it all together. The army. Let's make that much bigger. The army with which Napoleon invaded Russia on the 24th of June, about the same time Hitler does it, by the way, in the 20th century, is thought to have been the largest ever assembled for a single campaign up to that time. It comprised a troop of 20 nations. That's remarkable. Over 500,000 men were accompanied by 30,000 wagons and 150,000 horses and 28 million bottles of wine. How do you like that? That's unbelievable. In contrast, the Prussian Tsar Alexander I had only 120,000 troops at his disposal. And for the first 7 weeks of the campaign, Napoleon's army met with scarcely any military resistance. In August, the French decided to strike at the heart of Russia. the capital, Moscow. From the beginning of the expedition, the Grande Armée had met with difficulties. The retreating Russians had burned villages and destroyed the crops with which Napoleon had planned to feed his men and horses. The Russian weather had inflicted heavy losses, and by 6th September, when the French forces faced the Russians at Borodino, 72 miles west of Moscow, Napoleon's army numbered but 133,000 men against the Tsar's 120,000. It was enough, however, and on September 15th, Napoleon led his victorious troops into Moscow and settled into the Kremlin, the city citadel, to await the surrender of Alexander I. And just as they had sacrificed their villages and crops before the advancing French army earlier in the summer, the defeated Russians now torched their capital. The French were forced out of the center of the city and deprived of essential winter supplies when, after 5 weeks, must now be in November, the Tsar still had not capitulated. Napoleon decided to head back west to winter in Lithuania. On October 19th, the army began to retrace its steps. Okay, so we're in October. It was the worst decision the emperor made in a career of otherwise distinguished decisions, distinguished for their strategic brilliance, except for Egypt. I'm not talking about that. Napoleon had reportedly once said that an army marches on its stomach. But although he had left Moscow with enough food to last his men for 20 days, the horses upon which they relied to pull their carts had not been catered for. Napoleon had also underestimated the ferocity of the Russian winter. By the 23rd of November, when the French army, starving and harried by the attacks of Cossacks and Russian troops, reached Berezina River, the temperature had dropped to negative 25 degrees Celsius. It is said that at night the men disemboweled the dead horses and climbed inside their carcasses to keep warm. When the remains of the army reached the comparative safety of Vilna, the capital of Lithuania, on 7th December, the temperature had sunk to 32 degrees below 0 Celsius. By then, Napoleon himself was already speeding back to Paris to be sledged. Less than 18 months later, he was forced to abdicate his throne and went into exile on the Italian island of Elba. And what we see now, and we'll look at this tomorrow, is the conservatives will be back in power in France. The old altar and throne people, the Directory people, the conservative revolutionaries, they are now large and in charge. The Jacobins are far too weak to stage any sort of a comeback. They are large and in charge. And to dust off an old saying from ultimately the Bourbon Restoration, they had learned nothing and they had forgotten nothing. The old emigres, altar and throne people, conservatives, nobility, they had learned nothing in their disposition and they had forgotten nothing. So there will be time ahead now for vengeance, but not before Napoleon gives one final meteoric burst in history, and that is the 100 days. You think he's down for the count now that he's on Elba? Think again. Oh, think again. So we'll pick up with this tomorrow. My goodness, tomorrow is already Friday. The week has really gone by, and no holidays this time around, and yet it has drifted along very quickly. Again, I remind you to please consider the musical talents of Angela Malik, particularly in terms of instruction, whether that's music theory or consulting when it comes to the direction a child should take with music. Angela is without a doubt a leading musicologist. We have another slew of talented people. Angela represents the latest of the new collaborations that are coming on here. So do check that out. Here's her poster. Very soon I'll be posting an interview she and I did yesterday about her musical offerings here at Apocatastasis. Like I say, she is most capable, whether to teach online or if you happen to be in Texas, in person at her studio. So, a lot of great things happening at Apocatastasis, a lot of growth, and you're part of that. So thank you for your support. If you really like this project broadcast, you're welcome to come back tomorrow. But if you really, really like it, you're welcome to enroll in our undergraduate study, where we get into truly in its full vista Western culture, history, art, philosophy. Using the same project, we're all on the same page here at Apocatastasis, but there are a number of ancillary readings that flesh out the project in a much more mature fashion. So perhaps you have a future here at Apocatastasis, and I would encourage you to consider that. But for the moment, we are going to bring the bird down on this day 277 of the project. Again, we're going to start the project. Once again, day one will be August 31st of this year of 2025. So that's typically here in North America, the beginning of the school year, around there. And that's where we're going to pick up things. So very good. I wish you well, and I'll catch you when I catch you. Oh, one last thing. I see there's a comment by Omar Al Hassoun. Thank you for this project. We need it. Well, Omar, you're most welcome. You're most welcome, and I hope to catch you and everyone else tomorrow. Masalama.